Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling a really critical moment in the Cold War.
Absolutely. A real turning point.
Our source is Chapter 11 of the Crisis Years, Kennedy and Khrushchev, 1963. And our mission, well, it's to help you get a solid grasp of the lead up to and the immediate aftermath of the Berlin Wall going up in August 61.
Right. We'll be pinpointing the key players, what drove them, the immediate results, but without getting bogged down in absolutely everything.
Exactly. Just the crucial insights, the surprising bits drawn straight from this chapter you've provided. Consider this your streamlined path to understanding this pivotal event.
Yep, we're staying laser-focused on Chapter 11, not just retelling, but really digging into the strategies, the twists. It's quite a story.
Okay, let's unpack it. It seems like the real heat was coming from East Germany, specifically Walter Ulbricht. He was constantly leaning on Khrushchev to seal that border in East Berlin.
Constantly is right. We're talking 2, maybe 3 times a month, starting back in January 61.
Wow. So what was driving that? What was fueling this intense urgency?
It was the sheer number of people leaving. I mean, Ulbricht was telling Khrushchev that 2.5 million East Germans had already gone since 1949.
2.5 million.
And on top of that, you had something like 40,000 people crossing the border daily, many just to work in West Berlin. It was crippling their economy. They couldn't meet production quotas.
So an economic disaster looming.
And more than that, Ulbricht was genuinely warning Khrushchev about the potential for another uprising, like 1953. He feared this time it would actually succeed.
So Ulbricht's painting this picture of a stage is teetering on the edge, but Khrushchev, he didn't just jump on board immediately, did he? I remember something about the Bay of Pigs affecting his thinking.
Precisely. Back in March, Khrushchev thought closing the border was premature. The Bay of Pigs failure was fresh, embarrassing for the U.S.
Right. Didn't want to give Kennedy an excuse to intervene elsewhere, like Berlin.
Exactly. So he told Ulbricht, basically, get ready, prepare everything for a possible closure later. So the wheels were turning even then.
Interesting. So plans were definitely being made. But Ulbricht kept pushing, didn't he? He even suggested blocking the air corridors. That sounds incredibly risky.
Oh, massively risky.
Yeah.
That was in late July. Ulbricht actually proposed blocking the air lanes into West Berlin.
Wow.
Khrushchev shot that down immediately, forcefully. He knew interfering with air access could easily be seen as an act of war. It was a red line.
Definitely. A direct threat to West Berlin's survival. So, okay, ground barrier it is. And starting it on a weekend, that was deliberate.
Yes, very deliberate. The idea was, well, minimal disruption, fewer workers crossing, and maybe catch Western leaders a bit off guard, slower reaction time over the weekend.
Makes sense. But Ulbricht had to promise Khrushchev he could handle it, right? Keep order.
Absolutely. He had to assure Khrushchev his security forces could maintain control, and that the East German economy could survive if West Germany cut off trade, which was a real possibility.
And Khrushchev, even as he agreed, sounds like he had some doubts about Ulbricht himself.
That's a subtle but, yeah, important point. Khrushchev ultimately trusted Ulbricht's assessment of the situation, the desperation, and crucially, the prediction Kennedy wouldn't react militarily.
Okay.
But there was this undercurrent of mistrust. He apparently saw Ulbricht as a bit arrogant. His confidence wasn't total. Maybe his reading of Kennedy from their Vienna meeting, that Kennedy really wanted to avoid war, was the bigger factor.
And the initial plan wasn't even for a proper wall, just barbed wire.
Exactly right. The first directive was just barbed wire. Suggest caution, maybe testing the waters, see how the West reacts.
Like if they don't push back hard on wire, maybe we can build something more permanent later.
Could be. And strict orders.
Yeah.
Do not enter West Berlin territory. Absolutely not. The whole thing was planned in intense secrecy. Very small circle knew until the last minute.
Let's shift to Khrushchev's public signals. That speech on August 7th, hinting about closing the loophole, ironically, it seems to have backfired.
It's a fantastic irony, isn't it? He talks about needing a peace treaty, closing that loophole, meaning the refugee flow through Berlin, and what happens?
People rush out.
A massive surge. Nearly 2,000 people crossed in a 24 hours after his speech.
Yeah.
The highest daily number that year. His attempt to slow it down just sped it up.
Incredible. So public hints backfire, but in private, he sounds pretty confident the West won't do much about, a bit of wire.
Very confident. He told his top generals they were just putting up serpentine barbed wire. He predicted the West would just stand there like dumb sheep.
Dumb sheep. Shows maybe he underestimated the symbolic importance of Berlin to the Allies.
Definitely a significant miscalculation of Western resolve on that particular point.
And adding a layer of intrigue, the Soviet spy Oleg Penkovsky was actually in that meeting.
Yes, Colonel Penkovsky, a key source for the West. He heard Khrushchev say all this firsthand.
But couldn't warn the West immediately.
No, apparently the circumstances were too risky for him to pass the info quickly without blowing his cover. He later said, even if he had, he doubted the West could have stopped it in time anyway.
A grim reminder of the espionage game playing out. Khrushchev also sent a message to Kennedy using the Italian PM, Fanfani. What was the gist?
It was pretty blunt. He hammered home the point. Conflict over Berlin means nuclear war, no question.
Yikes.
He also complained about Kennedy's complex foreign policy and specifically mentioned Senators Mansfield and Fulbright.
Why them?
Because they'd made statements suggesting maybe the East Germans did have a right to control their border. Khrushchev likely thought they were reflecting Kennedy's private thoughts, and maybe he was probing, testing Kennedy's public stance.
Like poking to see if Kennedy would push back. And then, as the wire actually starts going up, Khrushchev makes himself scarce, leaves Moscow.
That's right. He went off to Kiev, then planned a vacation in Pitsunda.
Publicly, maybe it looked like business as usual, nothing major happening.
Privately, plausible deniability. If things went badly wrong, he wasn't physically there directing it. Some see parallels to his absence during Gagarin's spaceflight, a way to distance himself just in case.
Okay, let's pivot to Kennedy's reaction, or maybe the initial lack of one. That press conference on August 10th where he didn't push back on Fulbright's comment, that feels important.
Hugely important. It was widely read in the West and definitely in Moscow as basically tacit acceptance, or at least not strong opposition.
Like a green light, almost.
Or at least not a red one. His failure to clearly state U.S. opposition to closing the border. Yeah, Khrushchev noticed. It likely emboldened him. A seemingly small diplomatic point with massive consequences.
Meanwhile, Secretary of State Rusk is meeting with West German Chancellor Adenauer. They're talking peaceful solutions, unlike de Gaulle, who sounded ready for a fight.
Right. Rusk was trying to manage Adenauer's anxieties, stressing peace, maybe negotiations later.
Yeah.
He dismissed de Gaulle's hard line. We're there by right. Use force is outdated in the nuclear age.
But Adenauer wasn't buying the negotiation idea.
Not really. He was deeply suspicious of Khrushchev, felt the time for compromise was long gone. He was a skeptic about negotiating with dictators.
And Rusk floated this surprising idea about a decent regime in East Germany someday.
Yeah, quite remarkable. It suggests a kind of long-term, maybe wishful thinking. Like, if East Germany became less awful, the refugee problem, and thus the Berlin problem, might ease.
Almost academic at that point.
He even apparently confided his main goal for Berlin was just to hand the problem off to his successor.
Huh. Compare that to Khrushchev sounding off at a Soviet-Romanian meeting, threatening to crush NATO allies who interfered. But then he's friendly with Western diplomats.
That contrast is very telling. The fiery stuff was likely for his allies, projecting strength. But the friendly chat suggests he did want a negotiated way out, to avoid a direct military trial of strength over Berlin. He was a mix of threats and signals.
And where's Kennedy while all this is happening, as the first barriers go up? He's at Hyannisport.
Yeah, the image is striking. Kennedy on Cape Cod, getting checklists for nuclear war options, knowing there's a presidential fallout shelter nearby. While Berlin is being physically divided, it just underscores the immense pressure, even during downtime.
And the news itself was slow getting to Washington. No contingency plan for this specific scenario.
It's pretty astonishing. Took 6 hours for the State Department Ops Center to get solid info. And yes, all their planning was about West Berlin being cut off from the West, not East Berlin being sealed off from West Berlin, a major blind spot.
And Secretary Rusk initially downplayed it, decided not to wake the president.
Rusk's first take was that it was defensive. East Germany trying to stop the bleeding, the refugee flow. Not necessarily an attack on West Berlin itself. He wanted more information before briefing Kennedy, avoiding a knee-jerk reaction.
But when Kennedy did find out, he was angry, demanded to know why he wasn't told.
Oh yeah, reportedly furious initially. Understandable. But then his instructions were surprisingly cautious. Issue a bland statement, don't provoke, don't make things worse.
He even told Rusk to go to his baseball game.
Yeah, suggesting Rusk should stick to his plan to attend a Senators game. It signaled a desire to project calm, control, avoid escalating things, maybe avoid triggering that uprising Ulbricht feared and Kennedy likely wanted no part of after Hungary 56.
And then there was Ambassador Kohler's comment about the refugee flow becoming embarrassing.
Oof.
Yeah,
that was not great. Maybe reflected a kind of bureaucratic viewpoint about this strain on resources, but certainly lacked empathy for the human tragedy. came across as pretty callous.
Let's talk about West Berlin. Mayor Willy Brandt. His reaction sounds immediate and furious. Felt betrayed.
Absolutely. Brandt was livid. Responsible for his city's morale, he demanded Allied action, felt Ulbricht had deliberately kicked the West, and the West wasn't kicking back hard enough, a deep sense of abandonment.
And Brandt's own story matters here, right? His relationship with Adenauer, his earlier view of Kennedy.
Definitely. Brandt, the social democrat, ex-resistance fighter versus the older conservative Adenauer. There was tension there. He'd initially admired Kennedy's dynamism.
But this changed things.
Profoundly disappointed him, it seems. Many historians think Kennedy's hesitant response here directly influenced Brandt's later development of Ostpolitik, his policy of engaging with the East. Like, okay, if we can't fully rely on the West, we need another approach.
And that quote from Egon Bahr, Brandt's associate, on August 13th, we became adults, just cuts right through.
It really does. Captures that disillusionment. The harsh realization that West Berlin couldn't just depend on the Allies entirely. They had to grow up, face this new reality. The wall felt like a deep humiliation.
Back in Washington, the intelligence view was basically, well, the Soviets could always do this, so why the shock?
Right, advisors like Thompson and Bundy pointed that out. Controlling their own border wasn't technically a violation of agreements, it was something they could do. The surprise was maybe the timing, the boldness, and just the psychological impact of it actually happening.
But some in the administration wanted a tougher response right away. Gilpatrick suggested sending troops.
Yes. Deputy Defense Secretary Gilpatrick floated, sending a combat team immediately. Show resolve, maybe disrupt things. But General Maxwell Taylor strongly advised against it.
Too risky.
Very risky. High potential for casualties if the Soviets responded militarily. Kennedy sided with caution, avoid confrontation.
Bundy then suggested immediate talks, but Kennedy resisted. Felt the timing wasn't right politically.
Yeah, Kennedy felt pushing for negotiations right then, with public anger likely high, wouldn't work. Instead, he seemed to quickly grasp the propaganda potential.
How so?
The image of the wall,
Right.
barbed wire, then concrete. It was a stark visual, made the East look repressive, desperate, a failure. Kennedy wanted to exploit that contrast with the free city rhetoric.
Meanwhile, George Kennan, the old Cold War hand, is advising calm, seeing it as Khrushchev trying to stabilize things.
Kennan's view was that Khrushchev's main goal wasn't to provoke a war, but to stop East Germany from collapsing. The wall, however brutal, was a way to manage that crisis and maybe avoid a bigger fight over West Berlin itself.
But the situation on the ground in West Berlin was getting tense. Massive protests. And Brandt sends that very direct letter to Kennedy.
That protest, hundreds of thousands strong, and Brandt's letter really drove home the depth of the anger and fear. Brandt warned people might start leaving West Berlin en masse. He urgently asked for a stronger U.S. military presence, very blunt language.
And Kennedy's reaction to that letter was anger. He misread Brandt's motives.
It seemed so. Kennedy was apparently furious, sensitive to criticism, maybe suspicious. Brandt was playing politics with an upcoming West German election. He seemed to take Brandt's genuine fear for his city as a personal or political attack.
Interesting. Adenauer, in contrast, was initially calmer, right? And refused to even go to West Berlin.
Yes, Adenauer was wary of inciting something. He feared going might trigger an uprising the Soviets would just crush, like East Germany in '53. But then, true to form, he couldn't resist taking a partisan shot at Brandt, calling him Herr Brandt, alias Fromm, a reference to Brandt's exile name. Petty, really.
Classic Adenauer. Even with the wall going up, the Soviets were sending private messages to Adenauer, saying, calm down, we're not escalating further.
Yes, there were back-channel assurances. Basically, we're sealing the border, but that's it. Don't overreact. We need Western composure. Shows they were worried about escalation too, while still determined to build a wall.
But reports from West Berlin were getting dire, morale plunging, people scared.
Very alarming reports. Talk of panic, fear of a Soviet takeover. The city's confidence, its resilience felt seriously shaken. A real sense of isolation and vulnerability.
And Walt Rostow in the administration is emphasizing how vital Western access is for West Berlin's long-term survival.
Rostow's point was fundamental. West Berliners' will to stay depended entirely on knowing the West was accessible and committed. That connection was everything. Lose that, and you lose the city's viability.
Which leads directly to Kennedy deciding to send that battle group, about 1,500 U.S. soldiers, and sending VP Johnson, Bolin, and General Clay, too. Big symbolic move, though Johnson wasn't keen initially.
Right, the battle group was a clear signal. America stands with Berlin. Johnson's visit added political weight. He was reluctant at first, worried about Speaker Rayburn's health, the potential for violence, but Rayburn apparently told him he had to go.
And the British PM, Macmillan, thought it was militarily pointless but politically essential.
Yeah, Macmillan privately called it militarily nonsensical, but a necessary gesture. It wouldn't stop the Soviet army, but it showed solidarity, boosted morale, sent a message to Moscow. That was the point.
Now, Kennedy himself stayed publicly silent about the wall for a whole week, and the White House was putting out the word he was shocked and depressed.
That week of silence was calculated, likely to keep Berlin from exploding as a domestic political issue that might force his hand towards more risky actions. The press largely accepted the shocked and depressed narrative.
But privately, his view was different, that the wall was better than a war. Even made that comment about East Germans having had time to leave.
His private remarks show a very pragmatic, maybe even cynical view. The wall solved Khrushchev's immediate East German problem without a war over West Berlin. That comment about people having had years to leave? Yeah, deeply cynical and politically dangerous if it ever got out.
Which brings up that huge question. Did Kennedy signal acceptance beforehand? Through secret channels, maybe involving Robert Kennedy and the Soviet contact Bolshakov. RFK's story seems a bit confused.
That's a critical and murky area. Robert Kennedy claimed he refused to see Bolshakov right after the wall went up, which seems odd given how important that back channel was. He later admitted meeting him months later. It's highly probable the possibility of a border closure was discussed in that channel, even if specifics weren't agreed upon.
Historian Michael Beschloss suggests Kennedy kind of achieved an interim solution by letting the wall happen. It lowered the immediate temperature, plus gave the West a big propaganda win. But Kennedy's own role wasn't really scrutinized then.
Beschloss's take is pragmatic. The wall, horrible as it was, did de-escalate the immediate crisis over Berlin's status. And yes, the image was a huge propaganda gift to the West. But the question of whether Kennedy implicitly okayed it or could have stopped it wasn't really debated publicly at the time.
Though figures like Eisenhower and Acheson were privately critical, thought a stronger initial reaction might have worked.
Yes, old hands like Ike and Acheson felt Kennedy was too passive. They represented a more traditional view, push back hard immediately. They believed a strong show of force in the first hours might have made the Soviets and East Germans back down. We'll never know, of course.
Beschloss also thinks Kennedy figured failing to tear down the wall was less politically risky than people finding out he might have tacitly encouraged it.
That's a key insight into Kennedy's calculation. Trying to tear it down meant immediate risk of war. Letting it stand, while looking weak to some, was perhaps seen as the less dangerous path politically, especially if he could control the narrative, hence the initial silence, perhaps.
And it's really noticeable how Kennedy avoided even saying Berlin Wall publicly at first, a defining symbol, and he doesn't mention it.
His near-total public silence on the wall itself right after it appeared is remarkable. Whether to avoid provoking Moscow or to avoid drawing attention to his own administration's handling, it's debatable. Beschloss calls it not only bad leadership, but also risky politics.
So LBJ arrives in Bonn, then West Berlin. The battle group moves in. Big boost for morale. Johnson's visit sounds memorable.
Johnson's mission was all about reassurance. Huge crowds greeted him. His speeches were aimed right at lifting spirits, showing U.S. commitment. And yeah, his personal style, apparently ordering lots of china, shoes, wanting souvenirs, it was pure LBJ, maybe unintentionally effective in its own way. The battle group's arrival was met with massive relief, a tangible sign they weren't abandoned.
Kennedy's first public comment on Berlin post-wall was brief, and Johnson was reportedly saying off the record that Khrushchev felt he'd tasted blood, saw Kennedy as weak.
Kennedy's statement was still very cautious, avoiding escalation. Johnson's private comments reflected a more hawkish view that the Soviets saw the lack of forceful response as weakness, an invitation to push more.
Beschloss feels Kennedy managed the crisis better after the wall went up, learned from the Bay of Pigs maybe, and shifted focus to negotiating with Khrushchev.
Yes. Beschloss argues that, paradoxically, the wall solidified the status quo, allowing Kennedy to then manage the broader Berlin issue more strategically, having avoided war over the wall itself. He then actively pushed for diplomacy.
Sending that memo to Rusk, wanting the U.S. to take the lead in talks, maybe bypass the old four-power structure.
Exactly. That memo showed a shift. Let's be proactive, let's find new ways to talk, maybe directly U.S.-Soviet, not get bogged down in the old, slow processes.
And he set up that secret working group. Excluded the traditionalists, told them to find fresh ideas based on hints from Khrushchev.
Right. A small, secret group, Olin, Bundy, Sorensen people, known for flexible thinking. Kennedy wanted genuinely new approaches, trying to read between the lines of Khrushchev's signals, find an opening.
Then there was that brief scare, a Soviet proclamation about restricting access because of extremists. But Khrushchev quickly tried to smooth things over.
Yeah, that caused a brief flutter. Was this a new escalation? But Khrushchev used Fanfani again, and also the journalist Drew Pearson, to defuse it.
Pearson interviewed Khrushchev, portrayed him as wanting peace, ready for a summit.
Yes, Pearson's interview from Pitsunda painted Khrushchev as reasonable, peace-loving. Beschloss points out, though, that the timing was very convenient for Khrushchev, who might have been planning his next move elsewhere, possibly involving Cuba. It looked good, but maybe served a purpose.
There are also these reports of Kennedy pretending to be angry about intelligence failures, a way to deflect blame. Beschloss compares it to FDR after Pearl Harbor.
Could be. Feigning anger at the intel community might have been a way to manage public perception, make it look like he was caught off guard by incompetence below, rather than by his own choices or miscalculations. The FDR parallel suggests a savvy political awareness.
And also notable, the absence of calls for German reunification in Kennedy's statements after the wall, a tacit acceptance of division.
That shift is significant. Before the wall, reunification rhetoric was standard. Afterwards, it largely disappeared from Kennedy's major statements. It does suggest a pragmatic, if unstated, acceptance of the long-term division, prioritizing West Berlin's immediate security.
Beschloss also corrects RFK's timeline on meeting Bolshakov, adding to the mystery of those secret talks, and notes the parallel to the later Cuban Missile Crisis secret negotiations.
Right. The confusion over the RFK-Bolshakov meetings just highlights how sensitive and perhaps deliberately obscured some of this history remains. And yes, Kennedy's later reliance on secret channels during Cuba shows it was part of his preferred toolkit for high-stakes crisis management.
And finally, some footnote details. Kennedy met Eisenhower earlier in Potsdam, symbolic ground zero of the division. And Bundy later regretted JFK didn't condemn the wall sooner, more strongly.
Those details add texture. The Potsdam meeting connects Kennedy to the post-war reality the wall solidified. Bundy's regret echoes a common criticism that a stronger moral stand earlier might have been better leadership, even if risky. And the note about a U.S. concession during the battle group's passage shows the constant give and take even during shows of force.
So let's try to wrap up this deep dive. Essentially, the wall happened because Ulbricht was desperate, and Khrushchev calculated, probably correctly, that Kennedy wouldn't risk war to stop it.
Right. Kennedy, while publicly quiet and maybe privately relieved to avoid war, took heat for not being more forceful. The whole thing deeply scarred West Berlin and definitely changed how West Germany and the Allies approached the Cold War.
The real aha moments for me are Khrushchev really betting on Kennedy's aversion to conflict, Kennedy privately seeing the wall as, well, a hell of a lot better than a war, and just the constant tension between public statements and private calculations on all sides.
Absolutely. That gap between rhetoric and reality is stark throughout this chapter.
So here's a final thought for you. The wall did kind of stabilize the immediate Berlin crisis, right? Reduce the chance of a hot war right there. But how might things have gone if the West had reacted forcefully in those first hours? Bulldozers, troops. What does this episode tell us about that constant tightrope walk leaders face, avoiding immediate disaster versus the long-term cost of, well, inaction?
And with that, we have worked our way through Chapter 11 of the Crisis Years. We've covered the key events surrounding the wall's construction, the political chess moves, the diplomatic back and forths, the crisis atmosphere, the historical context, and Beschloss's analysis. We looked at the key people, the timeline, the real-world impact. We aimed to give you a comprehensive summary based on the source material provided.